Joining us now is Ken Johnson. He's the Associate Dean of Graduate Programs at the College of Business at Florida Atlantic University. And I first caught wind of his study that he had done with a few others on the buy versus rent index earlier this year. And joining us now to talk about it is Ken. Ken, thanks for coming on the program. Appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
So I don't know how I ran into this, quite honestly, but I found it pretty interesting. You guys compiled data going back to the early 1980s. To determine, hey, is the market as it looks right now, or from the data I see going through 2021, a historically better time to buy a home or rent a home? And I'm curious as to what you looked at and what the different factors are that went into this program.
Sure. So we've been curious for a decade plus about this buy versus rent decision. I do this with Ellie Braha, who's a co-developer down at FIU. The idea is if we can do all the pros and cons and make a horse race out of owning and building equity versus renting and reinvesting other monies into a portfolio of stocks and bonds, and then see which way those monies that you would have put into housing, which way will actually create more wealth. And interestingly enough, renting and reinvesting wins, but only by a very little bit. In the majority of cases, it wins. But again, the win is small. So the third option is renting and not reinvesting. And that's what people shouldn't be doing. So the moral of this is do one of the first two. But if you do rent, make sure you make that reinvestment. Otherwise, you'd be better off buying on average to create wealth.
And in particular, unsurprisingly, right, if you go take a look at the period of time from 05 or even earlier from then to 07, it was dramatically in favor of renting over owning at that period of time. What can you say about today's market? Because I think everybody looks at today's housing market, and there are comparisons that are made to the early 2000s in terms of pricing, in terms of cost of credit, things like that. What sort of comparison did you make with today's real estate market to earlier periods of time that we've seen?
Sure. So we do another index on a pricing premium or discount, which, by the way, are the top 100 metros around the U.S. Every metro is in at least a slight premium. When we look in the New England area, interestingly enough, there's a slight premium that you're paying, and it's lower than most parts of the country, quite honestly. And then when we look at these price to rent ratios, when you're at a historic average, which right now most of New England is actually their price to rent ratios are matching where they historically have been. So it's pretty much a toss-up between buying and building equity or renting and reinvesting on which way will create more wealth. It's pretty much a toss-up. So it usually makes for a pretty sound housing market. Rents are rising in the New England area, but only slightly more than the rest of the country. Prices are a little bit more stable. Incomes are very supportive of the prices, that's not the case in most of the country. So the market looks pretty sound. There's one major threat, I think, that the New England housing market faces going forward, and that's much more out over the horizon, and that's the demographic movements that are going to come about. In the next 10 years, the expected decrease in population in a 200-mile radius of Manchester, New Hampshire is going to be roughly 2.5 million people. Of the 28 million people there that you have now in that radius, you'll have 2.5 million people less. That's not going to be good for house prices.
When you look nationally, are there any housing markets that look interesting to you in either a very expensive or very cheap comparison to, I know you looked at New England for us, which I appreciate, but are there any other housing markets across the country that you look at as, oh, wow, that is very overvalued according to our metrics or very undervalued?
So as a general rule, when we look at what we measure when we do price to rent, which is just a derivative of the buy versus rent,
Sure.
Pricing performance on home prices are weaker in the western half of the United States. The price to rent ratios are very, very high. It's very much like a PE ratio. You're paying too much for $1 of annual rent in this particular case. So you see price performance on the eastern half of the U.S., east of the Mississippi, if you will, where better price to rent ratios are there, much lower, getting a better return just on the rent rolls alone. So price performance is more stable in the eastern half of the United States than in the western half. Perhaps the market that I think is maybe the most surprising, maybe I'm a little biased, but I'm here in Southeast Florida, and the Florida markets are very interesting at this point in time because unlike the New England markets, we have some things are similar, some things quite a bit different. Our premiums are very high. 9 of our measured metros in Florida are in the top 15 in terms of a pricing premium.
Mm-hmm.
But unlike the New England area, our expected growth rate in the next 10 years is somewhere on the order of 15% in terms of population expansion.
Right.
So hopefully the increase in population will solve some of the pricing problems we have, but we definitely are in for an affordability issue here in South Florida.
Ken, I want to talk about one thing it's pretty nuanced in the study, which is your findings show that pretty much throughout most of the time periods that you measured, that people would in fact be better off by renting and reinvesting those savings from paying rent instead of owning a home and dealing with the maintenance and mortgage and everything like that into an investment portfolio. That's effectively what your study showed. Am I misreading any of that? Is that effectively what what the history of your study was able to show?
That's absolutely true. Renting and reinvesting on average is in terms of wealth creation is beating out buying a home and building equity. So we take out we on the rental side, we reinvest into a market portfolio, 60-40 mix that has the same volatility as your housing market that we measure. Mm-hmm. We then account for in terms of the buy side, the taxes, insurance, maintenance, other costs that you would face, cost of sale when you would resell. We look at 8-year, 10-year, and I believe it was 15-year windows. The study's a few years old now. So, but consistently renting and reinvesting wins. And the primary reason for that, Mike, is simply because equities and bonds on average, especially equities, have outperformed housing in the last 20 to even 40 years. The interesting thing, though, is the win is only by a small amount.
Yeah.
So I encourage people, don't be afraid to buy, but if you do rent, make sure you make that reinvestment. Be monastic about that discipline to put that money into that portfolio every month.
And that's the piece that I'm sure we all see, which is human behavior doesn't usually work that way. When you've got that extra few bucks in your checking account, it gets pretty tempting.
That's correct. And so when we say that markets are pretty much a toss-up, which we're seeing mostly in the New England area right now, I'm not surprised that home ownership is still at relatively very, very high levels, simply because there's going to be that temptation to take the vacation. There's going to come these expenses that pop up, and you'll have to repair the car or do something, make some other investment or spend the money otherwise. So it's pretty much a toss-up. It does make for a sound market. And again, just coming back to New England, I think the only real problem in the housing market there is over the long-term horizon, and that's with the demographic shifts out of New England.
Ken Johnson is the Associate Dean of Graduate Programs at the College of Business at FAU, and joins us today to talk about the national housing markets and those here in New England as well. Thanks, Ken. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.